I should begin with the sound of hooves on a summer road, and a tune half-whistled, half-forgotten. Memory rarely starts with the important things. It does not give us banners, speeches, or dates, neatly inked into chronicles. It starts with dust in the throat, a stone in the boot, a horse that stumbles just when you are trying to find the right rhyme, and a friend who answers your complaints with a grunt instead of sympathy. The friend was, of course, Geralt of Rivia. On that day we were riding toward Gorse Velen, the sea wind still far ahead of us, and the smell of stable hay clinging stubbornly to our gear. I remember thinking that life, for once, had taken on a tolerable rhythm. Contract here, performance there. A few coins honestly earned, and a few not quite so honestly. The sort of petty, manageable chaos that makes a wandering poet feel almost respectable. If you had stopped us on that road and told me that the world was about to tilt on its axis, I would have laughed, adjusted my lute, and asked whether you preferred a tragic ballad or a humorous ditty. I had heard rumours, of course. A bard who ignores rumours is like a miller who forgets the river exists. Yet at that time, Nilfgaard, war, and conclave of mages were still convenient words to tuck into verses, not heavy stones to be carried in the chest. It is strange how often disaster walks beside you for miles, patiently matching your pace before it bothers to introduce itself. We had passed through villages that pretended to be peaceful. Children chased chickens in the yards, and old women scolded them with the same phrases they had used for decades. Yet the men in those villages watched the road too often. They put down their tools too quickly when strangers appeared. They drank in silence that had nothing to do with thirst. The price of bread had crept up. Innkeepers had become cautious about extending credit, and local gossips, those tireless historians of the present, spoke less about love affairs and more about levies, taxes, and missing sons. Geralt noticed it before I did, naturally. Witches are trained to read tracks in mud, the shape of a broken twig, the smell of blood under rain. I read faces and gestures, and I confess I tend to focus on expressions that promise applause, laughter, or a free drink. Still, even I could not ignore the way innkeepers' smiles froze at the mention of certain names, how conversations dissolved whenever someone said king or sorcerer a little too loudly. One evening, as we sat in the corner of a cramped tavern, I tried to cheer the room with a lively song about a jealous shoemaker and his unfaithful wife. Normally, such things are guaranteed to draw laughter even from men who have spent the day arguing with their cows. That night, the response was muted, as if my verses had to pass through a layer of invisible wool. A man near the door stared at the street instead of the serving girl. The air smelled of smoke and unease. Afterward, Geralt said very little. He never did waste words. But his silences had different weights, and I had known him long enough to feel the difference between I am tired and I am listening to something you cannot hear. That night, his quiet was of the second kind. When I asked what troubled him, he shook his head, muttered something about people sensing storms before they see clouds, and went upstairs. I lay awake longer than I admitted. Poets are supposed to be sensitive, attuned to the subtle vibrations of the age. The truth is that we prefer our tragedies to arrive fully written, with beginnings, middles, and ends. Living inside one is a far less elegant experience. It is made of small dissonances, a door closed a little too firmly, a joke that falls flat, a guard patrol where yesterday there was only a bored sentry. Looking back, I can see that the continent was moving toward what the sages later called the time of contempt, and that we were trotting along near its centre, blind as horses with decorative plumes over their eyes. At the time, however, I was mostly worried about whether the humidity near the coast would warp my loot, and whether our modest savings would survive Geralt's habit of accepting discounts whenever a job involved frightened children. Perhaps you know that feeling, the way we cling to small, manageable concerns when the larger ones are still shapeless. We worry about rent, about a late letter, about a neighbour's sharp tongue, and ignore the shifting of the ground beneath our feet. Only later do we realize that the evening when the baker suddenly closed early, or the day the town crier's voice trembled during an announcement, marked the first notes of a much darker melody. But we might still wonder whether we should be blamed for not recognizing a storm when all we could see were clouds that looked like any other. If this sounds melancholy, forgive me. Time lends seriousness even to my own foolishness. On that road to Gorsvelen, I was not wise. I was humming, counting the possible rhymes for Velen, and wondering whether there would be an audience appreciative enough to request an encore before they began throwing vegetables. I was thinking about the cut of a certain lady's dress I had admired 2 towns back, and whether the beer on the coast would be less watery than in the inland villages. These are not lofty preoccupations, but they are human ones. Geralt, for his part, worried in silence and checked the edges of his swords. I chattered about patrons, poetry, and platefuls of fresh fish. Between us, we formed a fragile balance. His vigilance and my denial, his readiness to draw steel and my determination to keep playing until the last chair in the tavern was empty. In the end, it is often such pairs that walk into history without realizing it, the wary and the careless, the fighter and the fool. Later, when the chronicles are written, the fool is flattened into a comic relief, and the fighter into a list of victories and defeats. What those chronicles rarely mention is the way the fool sometimes pauses, somewhere on a dusty road, with a song dying on his lips. That, more or less, is where our story truly begins. The farther we rode, the more the road began to talk. At first, it spoke without words. We saw shutters closed in full daylight, fields left half-hoed, laundry snatched in before the sun had set, dogs barked too long at strangers, and then, as if remembering something better left unsaid, fell silent together. A country can hold its breath just as a man can, and by late summer, the north felt like a room where someone had just blown out a candle. In the first village, after that uneasy tavern, the inn's signboard hung on one hinge, the painted tankard split by a long crack. Inside, the common room was clean, too clean, as if someone had scrubbed away not only dirt, but memory. The innkeeper poured beer with hands rubbed raw and asked fewer questions than any prudent host should. When I tried a harmless jest about tax collectors, his mouth twitched, but never quite became a smile. "Fewer travellers these days," he said, wiping the same patch of counter again and again. Roads not what it was. Behind him, in the doorway to the stable, a boy watched us with narrowed eyes. It was not the open stare of a child fascinated by strangers, but the hard, weighing look of someone who has listened to adults whisper after dark. I remember thinking that he was already learning the first word of the new language spreading across the land: distrust. As we moved on, rumours began to cling to us like dust. At one crossroads, a peddler swore Nilfgaardian scouts had been spotted in the south, black cloaks flickering like crows. In the next town, a miller's wife insisted a northern king had been poisoned, though she could not settle on which one. A shepherd claimed mages were preparing a spell that would devour whole armies. In a market square, a beggar leaned close to tell me that Princess Ciri of Cintra rode again, leading ghostly horsemen and avenging her fallen kingdom. I listened, of course. A bard is a vessel for such things. We carry tales from door to door like water in a cracked jug, sometimes clear, sometimes muddy, always needed. I noted the sharpest phrases, the most vivid images, already turning them into stanzas in the back of my mind. A cynical listener might say I was simply collecting material for my next ballad. That cynical listener would not be entirely wrong. Geralt, though, sifted the same stories through a different sieve. Where I heard metaphors, he looked for tracks. Where I heard opportunity, he heard artillery. We would walk away from another breathless account of assassinations and secret alliances, and he would quietly ask questions that made the tale crumble. Who had actually seen this? When? What had followed? You only trust stories that end with a dead monster and a paid invoice, I told him one afternoon as we led our horses through a shallow ford. Politics is just another kind of beast. It does not have claws you can see, but it leaves scratches all the same. He grunted. With Geralt, a grunt can mean disagreement, agreement, or indigestion. I chose to hear agreement. It made the road feel a little less lonely. Yet even I, merrily gathering tales of poisoned kings and ghostly princesses, began to feel a change in the flavour of the talk. Rumours, in calmer years, are mischievous things. They slip through keyholes, snicker behind people's backs, and vanish in the morning light. These rumours were different. They were sharp, proud, unforgiving. People no longer said I heard that perhaps. They said, it is known that. And any doubt was met with the look usually reserved for traitors or fools. Once, in a cramped inn near a border crossing, I heard 3 men arguing over ale. One swore that every mage in the Brotherhood was a traitor. Another insisted they were the only bulwark against Nilfgaard. The third announced that kings and sorcerers were all alike and deserved the same rope. Their words clashed like blades, but underneath lay the same hard certainty. Someone must be blamed, and blamed in advance. It struck me that the time of contempt would not arrive with fanfares. It would seep in quietly through throats that had grown used to speaking in absolutes. That evening, determined to reclaim the world for laughter, I turned the day's rumours into a song. I composed a playful tune about kings who trusted spies more than bakers, about generals who moved beans on a plate as if they were armies on a map. The refrain mocked pompous speeches with a catchy little twist. It was good work. I have never been shy about praising my own genius. By the second chorus, though, something felt wrong. The laughter in the inn did not sound amused. It was hard, edged, almost hungry. Men began to shout their own verses between mine, naming real rulers, real mages, spitting out curses that had nothing to do with metre or rhyme. "Sing about burning their banners," someone yelled. sing about sorcerers swinging from their own towers. The room roared approval. For once it was not my performance they were applauding, but the idea of humiliation, of vengeance in general, directed at whoever their private enemies happened to be. My fingers faltered on the strings. I ended the song too quickly, with a clumsy final chord that would have shamed an apprentice. Geralt's chair scraped back as he rose. His hand rested lightly on the hilt at his hip, not threatening, merely reminding the room that steel exists. No one stopped us leaving, but a silence followed us to the door, the heavy kind that smells of spilled beer and unspoken wishes. Outside, under a low, dull sky, he asked, "Still think it is all just talk, Dandelion?" I studied the ruts in the road, the muddy imprints of cartwheels and bare feet. "Oh, it is talk," I answered. "That is what troubles me. People are falling in love with it." For a heartbeat, he looked at me as if I were a stranger, then nodded once. We said nothing more. Not everything was solemn. Life refuses to keep to a single tone. We still argued with innkeepers over stabling fees, still rolled damp cloaks in the morning, still suffered Geralt's attempts at cooking when we camped beneath the hedgerows. I mocked him for burning stew. He mocked me for rhyming glory with story yet again. We shared flasks, curses, and ridiculous jokes told at the worst possible moments, which are also the best. If you have ever laughed in the middle of bad news, simply because the alternative was to break, you know the shape of those evenings. Yet even those small quarrels seemed to take place against a backdrop that had grown darker. The laughter came, but it flickered like a match in a large, cold room. By the time the first tang of sea salt reached us on the wind, I knew we were not simply travelling through countryside. We were moving along veins that were beginning to pulse faster, carrying fever toward the heart of the north. The road that had once been just a line on a map had turned into something else. A boundary, a rumour highway, a place where people rehearsed the anger they would soon be asked to perform with steel. I did not yet know the phrase, time of contempt. No one did. But its taste was already in the air. You do not simply arrive in Gorsvelen. It announces itself long before the walls appear. The air thickens with salt and tar. The road turns to stone, and the noise rises from a murmur to a chorus. By the time the first crooked roofs showed above the slope, we were already caught in the city's gravity. For a bard, a port like Gorsvelen is a promise. Coins from every kingdom, rumours in several languages, hearts loosened by wine and anonymity. For a witcher, it is another nest of trouble, where monsters wear boots and own warehouses by the docks. Geralt and I rode in with both sets of expectations, which meant we were both right and both mistaken. The gate guards barely glanced at our papers. Their eyes moved over the crowd instead, weighing smugglers and deserters. I settled for roasted nuts and the knowledge that my purse was now lighter. Cities like Gorsvelen start charging admission long before you find an inn. The streets sloped toward the harbour, each lane its own melody. One reeked of fish and frying oil, another of incense and perfume. Sailors and soldiers jostled merchants. Beggars held out bowls with a weary professionalism that turned charity into trade. I like such places. They are exhausting but honest in their dishonesty. A village may pretend on feast days that everyone believes the same and loves the same king. A port cannot afford the luxury. Geralt saw other details, corners watched by men who were not city guards but moved with authority, alleys that fell silent as we approached. Too many mercenary badges for a peaceful town. Where I saw colour, he saw concentration of forces. "We will find lodging near the harbour," he said. "Easier to leave quickly." "You wound me," I answered. "A bard prefers to think we arrive to stay and carve our names into memory." "Soft hearts bruise," he said. "Hard eyes remember faces. Both are inconvenient." We took rooms at an inn whose signboard displayed a very optimistic mermaid. The owner recognized Geralt by his medallion and me by reputation. Within an hour I had arranged a performance and half the door money. Within 2, Geralt had vanished into the city to see someone, which usually meant walking into matters I would only hear about later when they came looking for us. Left alone, I did what any self-respecting poet would do. I went out to listen. You can stand at the mouth of a single alley in Gorsvelen and hear the whole continent arguing with itself. On one corner, sailors from the south cursed northern tariffs. On another, northerners cursed southern grain. Outside a temple door, worshippers wondered whether the coming war would be a test or a punishment. The words Mage's Conclave floated more than once above the noise. Thaned, Aretusa, Brotherhood. People spoke these names as they would storm or plague, not as things they understood, but as forces that would sweep over them regardless. In a cramped tavern, a drunk declared that sorceresses would finally put an end to all the useless kings. At the next table, a merchant called Mage's Snakes fattened on royal favour. No one there had seen the council chamber of Aretusa, yet everyone claimed to know exactly what should happen in it. It struck me that Gorsvelen was not merely a city of trade, it was a market of explanations. People bought and sold stories about why the world felt the way it did. Each tale had the same shape. Someone else was to blame, someone far away was in control, and the teller was innocent, a leaf in the wind. Such narratives are comforting in a crooked way. If a hidden hand is responsible, we need not examine our own. In the evening, when I climbed onto a makeshift stage in the inn's common room, I carried that thought with me. Faces crowded the smoky space. Sailors, dock workers, clerks, a few strangers, whose quiet watchfulness suggested they listened for more than tunes. They wanted music, yes, but also confirmation of something they already half believed. I began with a gentle song about journeys and homecomings, the kind that reminds people of places they miss but rarely visit. The room softened, shoulders loosened, mugs clinked. For a while the harsh lines of the day blurred. Then I sang of the sea, of storms that made merchants humble and calm, days that made sailors restless, of water that belonged to no banner. The sea is a convenient metaphor. It can stand for fate, for war, for debt, for love. Each listener chooses what to hear. Between verses, I watched their eyes. When I mentioned kings, they flickered. When I mentioned mages, they narrowed. When I sang of ordinary people caught between powers, silence deepened. It was not the silence of boredom, but of recognition. They knew themselves to be the ones trampled when giants quarrel. Afterward they paid me in coins, ale, and questions. Was it true Nilfgaardian cavalry could ride from border to border without stopping? Had I seen a sorceress call down lightning? Did I think the conclave on Thanedd would prevent war or ignite it? I answered as honestly as possible, telling the truth about what I had seen and shaping the rest into careful metaphors. A bard should never add fuel to a fire already licking at the eaves. Later, climbing the stairs to our room, I thought of masks. Gorsvellen was full of them, though most were invisible. Merchants wore concern for the common good over naked self-interest. Officials wrapped greed in the language of duty. Citizens hid fear behind loud certainty. Even I had my chosen role, the witty observer, the harmless fool with a sharp ear and a sharper quill. We choose our disguises, believing they protect us. We rarely ask from whom. Perhaps that is always the way in such seasons. When people sense change but cannot yet name its shape, they reach for masks that allow them to keep moving. And we, who travel from town to town describing the tide, must ask ourselves a quieter question. Are we only observing, or are we, in small and pretty ways, helping it rise? That night in Gorsvellen, as harbour bells marked the late hour, and gulls cried over the dark water, I did not yet know how close the answer lay. I did not meet Ciri on Thanedd. That is important to admit at once, before memory begins to embroider. When she climbed the white stairways of Arethusa and looked out over the sea from those high terraces, the only music at her back was the wind in the arches. I was in Gorsvellen, a few miles and several worlds away, arguing with innkeepers and pretending I understood the plans of kings and mages. What I know of her days among sorceresses came later, in pieces. A few sharp remarks from Yennefer that slipped out like sparks. A confession from Triss when wine had loosened her usual caution. Words whispered by other novices who had studied beside Ciri, and could not forget the girl with the serious eyes and the scar that did not suit her age. I like to imagine her first sight of Arethusa. The school rises from the rock like something grown rather than built, all pale stone and glass that catches the light. Water breaks against the cliffs far below, with a rhythm that feels ancient and indifferent. For centuries, girls with the gift had walked through its gates and emerged as women who could bend storms, redirect rivers, topple thrones without unsheathing a single blade. The walls remember, they watch. Ciri arrived there, not as a nameless novice, but as someone already bearing too many titles. Princess of Lost Cintra, ward of a witcher, child promised by destiny, guest of Yennefer of Vengerberg, who was not in the habit of escorting anyone without a reason. It is difficult to remain a child when every corridor you walk down has already heard your story, distorted and decorated. The sorceresses, I am told, watched her with overlapping intentions. Tissaia de Vries saw a potential student whose raw magic needed discipline. Philippa Eilhart and the others saw a piece on their invisible board. Yennefer, for once, seems to have seen only a girl who frightened her in ways she would not admit. For Ciri herself, it must have felt like walking into a hall of mirrors where each reflection demanded a different future. There were other girls at Arethusa, of course, daughters of noble houses sent to be shaped and polished, peasant girls who had lit fires with their anger and been collected before their villages decided to burn them instead. They shared classrooms, dormitories, whispered gossip under the covers, while illusions fluttered along the ceiling. In those small hours, friendship and rivalry were forged in the same breath. One of them told me years later that Ciri did not sit like the others. She perched, ready to move, as if the bench were a horse that might bolt. She listened closely, yet often looked past the teacher toward the windows, toward the open world beyond the glass. When she made mistakes in exercises, she bit her lip until it went white, refusing to let tears fall where others might see. She struggled with the discipline of magic. This is not surprising. Ciri had learned to survive by instinct, the quick dodge, the sudden sprint, the wild strike with whatever lay at hand. Arethusa asked her to replace that immediacy with structure. A spell must be shaped, held, released with precision, not hurled like a stone in panic. For a child who had ridden with witches and fled burning cities, patience felt like another kind of prison. Yet there were moments of joy. I cling to that belief. No one spends all their time in fear, not even in such places. There were lessons on the terraces where the light turned the sea into hammered silver. There were evenings when the girls tried on gowns sent from donors and laughed at each other, tripping over embroidered hems. There were stolen apples from the kitchens, shared in a circle with juice running down their arms. The kind of small rebellion that makes life bearable in institutions built on obedience. I like to think that when Ciri laughed among them, for a few breaths she forgot that she was anything more than another student. Not destiny, not princess, not pawn, just a girl with tangled hair and ink-stained fingers, arguing about whether a certain sorcerer was handsome or ridiculous. Still, the future pressed in. The corridors of Arethusa were lined with portraits and tapestries that reminded everyone who walked there what mages were for. Advisors to kings, shapers of policy, the elegant fingers that signed treaties and, in different circumstances, death warrants. Each lesson contained beneath the talk of symbols and energy an unspoken message. Power does not exist in a vacuum. It always belongs to someone, answers to something. Yennefer tried to shield Ciri from the worst of that knowledge. She failed, of course. How could she not, when she herself was one of the architects of that world? I am told that their quarrels echoed through more than one corridor. Ciri wanted to ride, to practice swordplay, to meet Geralt. Yennefer insisted on books, meditation, posture. Two stubborn wills, both born from pain, pulled in different directions by the same fear, that the girl would become either too strong or not strong enough. There were gentler moments between them as well, glimpsed in reflections. Yennefer adjusting Ciri's hair before a formal lesson, fingers unexpectedly tender. Ciri falling asleep during a meditation exercise, head slipping onto Yennefer's lap, the sorceress not moving for an hour so as not to wake her. No one painted those scenes, yet they remain more vivid to me than any portrait of councils and banquets. When I think of Ciri there, I cannot help wondering how much she understood of the web gathering around her. Children sense tension even when adults hide it behind polite smiles. She would have felt the quickening pace of hushed conversations in the teachers' chambers, the way letters arrived and were burned more frequently. She would have noticed that certain names spoken aloud produced a silence as sharp as a slap. Did she stand alone sometimes at the high windows, looking out toward the mainland? imagining roads and forests and muddy inns where people argued only about harvests and weddings? Did she press her forehead to the glass and wish, just for one night, to be less important, to belong not to prophecy, but to herself? We who are not there are tempted to treat such questions as decorative. We talk about factions and alliances, about who stood with whom in which chamber. Yet a child was learning to breathe in that charged air. Every choice the adults made would bruise or harden something inside her. We may know the surface of history, the dates and battles, but we might still wonder whether the hidden history of one young heart matters just as much. In later years, when I visited other schools and courts, I often thought of Aretusa, not only as a place where decisions were made, but as a place where a girl once walked between classrooms, carrying books that were heavier than they looked. I pictured the way her shadow fell on the flagstones, the way it lengthened toward a future none of those carefully educated sorceresses could completely control. Perhaps that is what haunts us most when we look back. Not the grand conspiracies, real or imagined, but the ordinary details we missed while they unfolded. The sound of chalk on a slate in a distant classroom, while somewhere else grown men sharpen their knives over maps. If you follow music long enough, it leads you into rooms you were never meant to see. In Gorsvellen, that path began with a folded note that smelled faintly of lavender and sealing wax, delivered to the inn by a boy who looked personally offended that someone like me should receive anything so elegant. The wax bore the sigil of the chapter of mages. The handwriting was neat, controlled, as if each letter had been drilled into formation. I was invited to provide entertainment at several private gatherings in the days before the conclave on Thaned. Discretion, the letter added, would be part of my fee. Geralt read it once and handed it back. "Be careful," he said. "Witches, alas, do not appreciate the delicate thrill of being summoned by powerful people for one's art." The first of those evenings took place in a townhouse clinging to the hillside above the harbour like a barnacle dipped in gold. Inside, the air itself seemed enchanted. Candles burned in colours they had no right to possess. The ceiling arched higher than the outside walls allowed. A fountain murmured in the middle of the hall, though no pipes led to it. Sorcerers have always disliked being constrained by small things like plumbing. Kings and envoys were not present yet. This was an early gathering, a rehearsal of masks. Sorceresses in intricate gowns drifted through clusters of nobles and wealthy merchants, speaking in phrases that could have been about weather or war, depending on how one listened. I tuned my lute and did my best to look harmless. Philippa Eilhart was there, of course. She moved through the room like someone who had designed it and remained mildly dissatisfied with the execution. Her eyes measured everything, even while her lips smiled. When she glanced my way, I bowed with what I hoped was the right amount of charm and humility. She nodded and moved on. I understood my position at once, a small piece on a board only she could fully see, to be nudged or removed with the flick of a manicured hand. I sang what they expected first, polished ballads of courtly love, a clever little piece about a merchant who tried to cheat a sorceress and ended up as his own account book. They laughed in all the right places. Servants poured wine that cost more per cup than most farmers earned in a month. The illusion of calm power was thick enough to taste. Yet under that smooth surface something restless moved. Conversations up mountains faltered whenever certain names appeared. Nilfgaard, Redania, Emir, Foltest. People said brotherhood. The way patients say cure, half believing, half afraid, it no longer applies. Officially, the coming conclave on Thanedd was a meeting of like minds. In that hall it already felt like a battlefield where the soldiers had not yet been told which way to charge. A few nights later, in a different house, whose owner changed his allegiance as often as his wine supplier, I watched two sorcerers argue quietly by a window. Their gestures were small, refined, but tension clung to them like static. I caught only fragments. Thanedd at dawn, loyalty to the north, necessary sacrifice. Words that sound noble over crystal and candlelight, and turn bitter when you imagine the faces of those who will pay for them. I played softer tunes that evening. Melodies that encouraged reflection and made people believe their own thoughts were profound. As I moved through the room with my lute, the music slipped around clusters of guests. Here a Nilfgaardian agent wearing a very northern cut of doublet. There a noble whose family had traded loyalty for survival more than once. Conversation stopped as I drew near and resumed in a slightly different key when I moved on, like actors remembering their lines too late. You might think such gatherings are very far from ordinary life, and in one sense you would be right. The goblets are heavier, the hangings thicker, the threats more elegantly phrased. Yet there is something familiar in the way people orbit those they believe powerful, hoping some of that power will rub off. Think of any office when rumours of restructuring begin. How some stand straighter when the director walks by. How others suddenly become fascinated by their own shoes. The stage is humbler, but the choreography is almost the same. One night I played in a smaller salon for a far narrower circle. No merchants, no minor nobility this time, only sorceresses and a handful of people whose titles were not spoken aloud, but whose influence could be felt like a draught under a closed door. Maps lay rolled on a side table. Wax seals on opened letters gleamed dully beside half-drunk glasses. Yennefer was there. When she entered, conversation shifted like a curtain caught by a gust. She greeted me with a nod that might have been warmth or warning. With Yennefer, those two are neighbours who share a wall. At one point, someone discussing leverage mentioned Ciri and used the word asset. I saw Yennefer flinch. It was a tiny thing, a tightening around the eyes, a pause in the hand lifting her glass. No one else seemed to notice. The discussion rolled on to voting blocks, and how many mages might support trimming the Brotherhood into something leaner, sharper, more obedient to certain crowns. But that one unguarded twitch told me more than all their polished sentences. In that candlelit room I understood that the conclave on Thanedd would not simply be about borders, treaties and institutional reform. It would also be a struggle over a girl who had not asked to be chased through history by prophecy and policy. I played on. That was my part. Notes floated over phrases like redefine neutrality, preemptive measures, containment. They debated how best to shape the continent. My melodies filled the gaps between their intentions. It occurred to me that art often serves like that in troubled times, a gentle veil drawn over sharper edges, making them easier to handle, less frightening to name. But we may still ask whether such veils protect people, or merely allow them to walk more confidently toward decisions they ought to fear. When these evenings ended, I walked back to our inn along streets where fishermen mended nets by lantern light and washerwomen argued over the price of soap. They knew nothing of secret ballots or faction lists. Their worries were simpler, but not smaller. A sick child, a bad catch, a landlord who had raised the rent again. I felt like a man forever crossing between two worlds, each convinced the other was mere background noise. Geralt listened when I recounted what I had seen and heard. He asked few questions. He did not care about vintage years or curtain fabrics. He wanted to know who sat with whom, which names drew frowns, which ones drew thin smiles that did not reach the eyes. I told him what I could. There were gaps, of course. There always are. Even a bard's gaze cannot be everywhere at once. By the time the first barges left the harbour for Thanedd Island, carrying mages in formal robes and nobles in their best discomfort, I knew we were approaching not a conference, but a crossroads. Invitations had been written, delivered, accepted. Yet behind every polite summons lay another unwritten one, calling each of them to reveal who they truly were when the light shifted. Music had led me into those bright, fragile rooms. It would not stay there. Soon enough, it would echo in very different halls. The night before we sailed to Thanedd did not fall. It thickened. Gor's velen seemed to dim from the inside, as if shutters had been drawn behind every window at once. Street cries shortened, doors closed sooner, and talk in the taverns dropped from boasting to muttering. Even the gulls sounded hoarse, circling low over masts that creaked like tired bones. Geralt grew quieter with each hour. For most men, silence is absence. For him it is armour. He cleaned his swords, checked buckles, repacked the same saddlebags twice. I had seen him ready himself for dragons with less method. Yet this time there was nothing to swing at, only plans and counterplans, names and allegiances. A witcher's blades are of limited use against those. Messages began arriving in a steady trickle. A rap on the door, a folded scrap, a wax seal already broken by too many hands. All very courteous on the surface, all humming with the same urgency. Some were invitations to discreet conversation. Others contained warnings wrapped in jokes. A few were nothing but an hour and a place. One such hour led us to a bathhouse. Spies love bathhouses. Steam and bare skin give an illusion of equality, while running water eats words. I was not invited into the inner rooms where conversations thickened, but I installed myself near enough to be useful and not so near as to be drowned. Geralt vanished behind a curtain in a roll of steam. Men and women drifted in and out. A heavy-set figure with a limp and watchful eyes. A narrow-faced clerk whose ink-stained fingers did not match his expensive robe. A woman with the calm of someone used to listening more than she speaks. They passed without names in my hearing, but their type was familiar. Kingdoms do not move because of banners. They move because such people push from below. Geralt reappeared briefly, damp hair tied back, skin flushed from the heat. He studied the tiled walls as if counting ears hidden in them. "Sing," he said, softly. "Hear, hear." So I did. A quiet song about a man who loves too late, the kind of tune that turns listeners inward. I sat by the plunge pool, fingers moving on the strings, while behind me voices rose and fell in half-sentences. Somewhere in the steam, oaths were traded, promises weighed. My music was a curtain of sound nobody noticed, just thick enough to make eavesdroppers lean the wrong way. It is a strange thing to be both present at and excluded from the making of history, humming on the threshold. That evening another note arrived, bearing a crowned eagle pressed deep into dark wax. I knew that sign. Its owner collected secrets as other men collect rare wines. Slowly, obsessively, with intent. We went to him at the appointed hour, to a warehouse that smelled of tar, hemp, and old lies. Inside, lamps burned low, throwing slices of yellow across stacked crates. Geralt walked ahead, every line of his body reading the shadows. I followed, trying to look like a man who had stumbled in by accident and fully expected to be shown the way out. The spymaster looked much as I remembered, barrel-chested, broad, bald, with the amused expression of someone arranging pieces on a board only he can see clearly. He did not waste time on greetings. Thanedd, he told us, would not be a debate, but a rupture. Some mages would fall, others would rise, and the north must decide which way to lean before the ground gave way. The question was not how to stop what was coming, but how to ensure that when roofs flew off, they landed on someone else's house. He wanted Geralt to stand in a particular doorway when the storm hit, to watch certain people, to favour certain others, to carry certain messages if the night turned bloody. Nothing treasonous, he assured us, simply cooperation, assistance, common sense. Every letter we had received carried the same fragrance, though the labels differed. Geralt answered with the old word he clung to like a lifeline: neutrality. Witches do not serve crowns. They kill monsters, not opponents. I have heard him say it many times, but never with such stubborn weariness. The spymaster listened, then smiled in a patient, almost kind way, like a man indulging a superstition in an otherwise capable employee. Neutrality, he said, was admirable in theory and obsolete in practice. Times had changed, lines were being drawn, even the refusal to choose was now, in fact, a choice. Then his attention turned to me. Poets, he observed, spread notions faster than proclamations. A decree needs a seal and a herald. A song needs only a humming mouth. Would I not, for the sake of stability, tune my verses so they did not undermine the fragile balance the North was trying to preserve? It was presented as a civic duty, as harmless as sweeping a threshold. I laughed lightly, joked about my inability to remember official slogans, about the unruly nature of rhymes. Humour has kept me alive in more places than steel. But beneath the jest, I gave him a real answer, that bards sing what they see, or they stop being bards and become town criers in prettier hats. He allowed the joke to stand, yet his eyes measured the refusal. Somewhere I knew my name slid a notch in a ledger I would never be allowed to read. We stepped out into air that felt colder than when we had gone in. The harbour lay below like a black gouty sheet pricked with trembling lights. Chains creaked, water slapped wooden hulls. A bell rang twice from a ship we could not see. "You could stay," Geralt said quietly. "Sell songs on both sides of the river, keep your head down, "And you could take a badge and a salary," I answered. "Let them tell you where to swing your sword." We looked at each other and said nothing more. Some differences cannot be argued away. They must simply be carried side by side. Back at the inn, the yard had turned into an ant-hill. Trunks were being strapped, barrels rolled, horses soothed or cursed into their stalls. Stable boys darted between wagon wheels, swearing when hooves came too close to their toes. A merchant argued over shipping rates with a clerk who had long since stopped listening. In one corner, a woman hugged a child so tightly the little one protested, then clung back just as fiercely. None of these people would be named in future accounts of the Thaned affair. Yet their lives too would be nudged by decisions made in high towers. We ate a late meal at a sticky table. The stew was oversalted, the bread half stale. Geralt grimaced and finished his bowl in 4 efficient mouthfuls. I complained theatrically about the damage to my refined palate until a hungry carter offered to relieve me of most of my portion. For a moment we were only 2 weary travellers in a crowded inn, annoyed by bad food and noise. The normal irritations of life felt almost luxurious. When Geralt went upstairs to check our gear for the last time, I stayed by the hearth. The fire had sunk to a red, patient glow. In a corner, 2 men played dice, the clatter of bone on wood sharp in the hush. Their stakes were tiny, a few coppers pushed back and forth, yet their faces were taut with hope and dread. Watching them, I thought of mages and kings and all the quiet figures behind them. They, too, were about to cast dice, though theirs were carved from towns and treaties from children they had never met. Later, we would dress their choices in grand words: necessity, strategy, destiny. In that dim room, with smoke stinging my eyes and the taste of cheap ale on my tongue, the gesture looked very simple: a hand, a throw, and lives skittering across a table. Near midnight, a final messenger appeared, cheeks flushed from the cold. He handed me a brief, unsealed note: the hour our boat would leave for Thaned, and a polite reminder that performances on the island were to be accompanied by discretion. I crumpled it once and fed it to the coals. For a heartbeat, the paper flared, words turning to light, then ash. Tomorrow, I told myself, would belong to mages and their great designs. Tonight still belonged to those of us who could, in theory, choose to sleep. But we might still wonder whether sleep is possible when the floorboards themselves seem to be listening, waiting to learn which way the house will fall. The morning boat to Thaned was far too small for the weight it carried. Mages, envoys, advisers, a witcher, a bard, and between us enough intentions to sink a fleet. The craft itself was a tar-scented tub with peeling paint, its benches complaining under silk and brocade. Power likes modest vehicles. It prefers to arrive quietly and spread once the doors are closed. Mist lay flat on the water. Thaned rose ahead as a pale smudge, then a cliff, then towers catching light. Arethusa crowned the rock, white and intricate, its windows drinking in the sun. Fortresses I had seen before boasted of their strength. Arethusa did not boast. It glowed, like a spell someone had forgotten to end. Geralt stood at the bow, boots planted wide, watching the island the way he watched caves that smelled wrong. I tried to coax from him some appreciation for the view, for my future verses about floating chandeliers and perfumed corridors. He answered with a grunt that clearly meant counting guards, not clouds. We disembarked at a narrow quay, cut into the rock, and climbed steps that clung to the cliff face. Magic greeted us before any host did. Sigils flared above the arch as each guest passed. Banners rippled without wind. Eagles wheeled overhead and dissolved into sparks. It was theatre, meant to remind everyone whose house this was. I told myself I would later mock the spectacle in a song. Halfway up the stairs, I realized I was already walking more softly. Inside, corridors spiraled upward through polished stone. Servants moved with rehearsed precision, bearing trays and fabrics that shimmered in unnatural hues. Somewhere beyond the walls, voices chanted in languages that sounded like carved glass. The whole place felt like an instrument tuned a fraction too high, waiting for the first note. When evening came, the banquet hall of Arethusa opened like a conjured flower. Chandeliers floated without chains, drops of light hanging from them like fruit. The ceiling showed a night sky that was not the one outside. Constellations formed slid apart, returned in new patterns. Long tables glittered with silver and crystal. Servants in dark livery moved carefully, aware that one broken dish might cost more than a year of their lives. My place was not at the high table, of course, but on a small dais with my loot, within convenient sight of everyone. From there I could observe how silk and steel mingled. To one side, a cluster of sorceresses in gowns like captured storms. Philippa with her half-hooded gaze, weighing everything. Tissaia de Vries, upright, as if the hall had been built to confirm her ideas about order. Others whose faces I knew from portrait copies in lesser cities, now very much alive and outlining the future with each glance. Farther down sat nobles, envoys, and favoured guests, arranged with the care usually reserved for alchemical experiments. Old grudges and new alliances disguised themselves as seating preferences. No one admitted that a chair's distance from the main doors mattered, yet every head turned when those doors opened. Yennefer chose her own moment to enter. Her gown was black enough to make the shadows look grey. Jewels at her throat and wrists caught the floating lights without a tremor. She did not look my way, yet I felt assessed and filed. Geralt sat among knights and lesser lords who understood blades better than sigils. They watched him as one watches someone else's dangerous tool. Interesting, but safest untouched. After the first course, as conversation began to sag under the weight of food and self-importance, the master of ceremonies inclined his head. My turn. I stepped onto the dais, feeling the old tightening in my chest. I have played for peasants who paid in onions, and for courts where a misplaced word meant exile by morning. Yet this room was different. The people here, listening between sips of wine, would soon tilt the continent. I began with a song about the sea, its indifference to borders and banners, its habit of returning what men try to drown. The melody was gentle, the words carefully nameless. Faces eased. Even sorcerers like to be reminded that something lies beyond their control. It makes their own chosen realms feel more manageable. Between verses, I let my gaze wander. An advisor leaned close to murmur in a mage's ear. The mage's hand paused on his glass before he nodded. Two sorcerers who supposedly hated each other raised cups in a toast that stopped just short of their eyes. A novice slipped in behind a pillar, plain grey dress, a small island of honesty amid brocade, eyes wide and shining. There was laughter, brittle and bright. Someone made a joke about Nilfgaardian fashion. Someone else answered with a jab at northern manners. I followed with a light piece about a noble who tried to impress a sorceress by listing his castles, only to find she preferred a well-stocked library. Safe material, flattering the right audience, poking fun at the right victims. The hall rippled with amusement. For a little while they allowed themselves to believe wit could still deflect danger. Yet beneath the smiles, threads tightened. I felt them in the way silence sharpened when Vilgefortz shifted in his chair, in the careful attention given to Tessire's smallest remark, in a brief, precise nod. Philippa sent toward a figure half hidden by a column. One does not need to know a code to recognize that it is being used. Playing in that hall was like plucking a web. Every note seemed to vibrate along unseen lines. A careless phrase could become tomorrow's whispered slogan. A clumsy quip might turn into tonight's unforgivable insult. So I walked the usual tightrope. Honest enough that I could later look myself in the eye, cautious enough to keep my head comfortably attached. Meanwhile, the illusions overhead changed. Stylized beasts, flowering vines, scenes of past victories rendered prettier than they had ever been in reality. None showed the things these people truly feared. It was as if they were reminding one another of their power, while carefully not naming what they intended to do with it. During a pause, as servants refilled cups and guests shifted in brocade and chainmail, I noticed the reflections of the floating lights on the polished floor tremble ever so slightly. Not from magic, I think, but from the simple weight of expectation. A whole hall full of people who had already agreed, each in their own way, that tomorrow must be different, and were now pretending to enjoy tonight. We do that often, we humans. We decorate the edge of our own cliffs. We hang lights, polish silver, arrange flowers, hire musicians. We give our fear a soundtrack and call it celebration. Perhaps it is our way of insisting that we still control something, even if only the moment before the fall. By the time I played my final, quieter tune about homecomings that come too late, the most important conversations had already slipped into smaller rooms, doors closed softly on more honest voices. I accepted the polite applause, bowed and stepped down. Servants began to clear plates with swift, careful movements. They had heard enough stray names to know this was no ordinary feast. Across the thinning crowd I caught Geralt's eye. For a heartbeat we regarded one another. A witcher and a bard in a house of magic, both out of place, yet bound to be there. He tilted his head with a wordless question. I gave the smallest shrug. The songs had gone well. The world was still sliding. We left the hall by different doors, carried along separate currents. Behind us, the candles continued to burn, and the illusions continued their elegant patterns, determined to finish the performance even after the audience had gone. But we might still wonder whether, in some quiet corner of its stone heart, Arethusa understood what this glittering night truly was. Not a triumph, but the last calm note before someone finally struck the waiting chord. The night after the banquet never truly became night. It cracked. We had been given guest chambers along one of Aretusa's side corridors, a compromise between honour and caution. The walls were thick, the bed more comfortable than any I had known in months, the window a precise arch cut over dark water. I should have slept like a man who has eaten well and performed better. Instead, I lay awake, listening to the building breathe. Great houses have their own sounds. Aretusa whispered. Pipes sighed. Distant doors clicked. Faint steps passed overhead with the measured cadence of patrols. Magic hummed behind plaster and stone, too quiet to be called a noise, yet intense enough to prick the skin. Somewhere down the hall, a novice laughed quickly and just as quickly stifled herself. I drifted between drowsing and alertness, like a sailor half afraid of storms that have not yet arrived. When the first wrong sound came, I knew at once. It was not a crash or a scream. It was the sudden, clean snap of an illusion being dismissed, as sharp as a string breaking on a lute. The glow under my door flickered, turned from warm to harsh, then steadied again with a different, colder quality. Aretusa had changed its own lighting, and not for a celebration. Then came the shouting, not the boisterous noise of drunk guests, nor the measured commands of guards drilling. This was layered, splintered, alarm spells flaring in clipped syllables, human voices answering in confusion, someone barking orders in a tone that did not invite questions. The corridor outside filled with hurried steps. Steel rang against stone, a brief, bright note that makes any man of sense sit up. I swung my legs from the bed as the door burst inward. Geralt moved through it, sword already in hand, eyes pale and flat. Behind him, the corridor strobed with flashes of light in 3 different colours, none of which promised anything as simple as fire. "Stay behind me," he said. I opened my mouth to argue that bards are valuable cultural treasures and should not be placed between factions of hostile mages. Another flare tore down the hall, leaving the air smelling of singed dust and something coppery. I shut my mouth and grabbed my lute out of habit, as if it might deflect a spell. Old instincts die harder than men. We stepped into a corridor that had, until that night, believed in the permanence of its own order. Now its polished floor was scuffed by boots, and spell scorched in erratic patches. A tapestry depicting some ancient magical victory smouldered along one edge. A statue lay on its side, a marble hand, broken off and rolling lazily in a groove between the tiles. 2 mages in formal robes stood at the far end, arguing with a cluster of armoured men whose tabards bore the colours of a northern kingdom. Their words collided in mid-air. By authority of the Brotherhood. On the orders of His Majesty, this tower is under our jurisdiction. No sorcerer leaves this floor. Their hands twitched near wands, amulets, sword hilts. Neutral phrases and ritual politeness failed one after another. It was like listening to a dam develop cracks. You could not see the water yet, but you knew it was there, pressing. Geralt steered me into a side stairwell before the first spell flew. It hissed through the place where we had stood moments earlier, splashing against the far wall in a shower of sparks that ate into stone. Someone cried out, their voice cut off mid-curse. Doors slammed, boots hammered above and below. On another landing, we nearly collided with a group of novices in grey, eyes huge, clutching books to their chests as if knowledge might serve as a shield. A teacher herded them toward a lower level, face composed, lips thin. As we pressed ourselves flat against the wall to let them pass, I saw that the hand gripping her wand shook very slightly. "What is happening?" one of the girls whispered. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with," the teacher answered. "Keep moving. Nothing you need to concern yourself with." That, from the mouth of Arethusa, while the walls themselves shuddered, was the most honest lie I heard all night. From upper floors came a deep, rolling thunder that did not belong to weather. The air smelled of ozone, hot stone, and that sharp tang of panic that has nothing to do with sweat and everything to do with realization. Commands were shouted, repeated, contradicted. One moment someone invoked the authority of the chapter. The next, another voice called the chapter treasonous. Names that had been spoken with deference at the banquet now arrived as accusations hurled down corridors. At a bend in the stairwell, we met soldiers in the livery of the island's own guard, grim and pale, moving with the unsure conviction of men who have been given orders they do not entirely understand. Their leader saw Geralt's swords and our lack of robes, and raised a hand. "By directive of the council, all unauthorized persons are to remain in their quarters," he declared. "They have just become very authorized," Geralt replied, stepping past without slowing. There is a way he uses his voice in moments like that, flat and final, that implies anyone disagreeing is welcome to try their luck. The captain hesitated, opened his mouth, then closed it and signalled his men to another corridor. Even in palaces of magic, steel still speaks a language everyone understands. We moved through a changing labyrinth. Hallways that had seemed spacious the day before now felt narrow, choked with rushing bodies and invisible currents of power. A window exploded inward in a spray of glass, sucked back together by a reflexive ward, then shivered again as something outside struck the barrier. For an instant I glimpsed the night sky over the sea, seamed with streaks of light like cracks in dark glass. Whatever conflicts had begun inside were not staying politely indoors. In a side chamber we stumbled upon a scene that haunts me more than the flashes of combat. A handful of mages in ceremonial dress stood in a half-circle, hands bound not with rope, but with rings of hardened light that glowed too bright to look at. Opposite them, other sorcerers, some I recognized from the salons in Gorsvelen, watched with expressions ranging from triumph to unease. One recited formal charges in a steady, distant voice, accusing the prisoners of treason against the North, collusion with Nilfgaard, betrayal of some grand, fragile order. The prisoners tried to speak, but each attempt dissolved under another spell. Their protests ran across the air as voiceless shapes. It struck me, absurdly, that this was what happened when people who wielded words like blades decided to break them. We did not linger. Geralt steered me away just as a new group entered the chamber, their arrival accompanied by another wave of accusations, another redefinition of loyalty. The building had become a court without appeal, every corridor a courtroom, every landing an execution ground waiting to happen. Somewhere above us, the storm broke fully. The sound came not as a single boom, but as a layered roar, shattering wards, collapsing illusions, the boom of something massive yielding. A tremor ran through the stairwell. Dust sifted from the ceiling. Briefly, all other noise faltered, as if every voice in Aretusa had paused to listen to its own foundations. Then chaos truly began. Spells flashed through open doorways, painting the walls in impossible colours. A gust of wind, powerful enough to tear banners from their poles, surged down a hallway, only to be diverted at the last instant by a counter-charm that left our ears ringing. A figure in armour crashed through an inner window, rolled and rose with a sword already swinging. For a heartbeat, I saw his face. A man no different from the guards at any city gate, now caught in a war of people whose names he would never pronounce correctly. We were pushed apart in the crush, briefly, terrifyingly. A surge of panicked servants ran between us, a wave of grey and brown and white aprons. Someone fell, someone cursed, someone prayed aloud to a god of hearths and small fires, entirely unsuited to this place of storms. By the time the tide passed, I had lost sight of Geralt. I called his name once, twice, swallowed by the din. The corridor ahead forked. To the left, more soldiers. To the right, the echo of a girl's voice, raised in a cry I could not make out. For an instant, I stood fixed. Two paths opening, both wrong for a bard, with nothing but a lute and opinions. I chose the quieter one. Call it cowardice, practicality, or the instinct of a man who knows he is more useful alive than heroic. I retreated into a side passage and found myself in one of Aretusa's lesser galleries. By some blessing or oversight, it was almost empty. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of mages from centuries past, frozen in robes that mocked the present with their calm. Through an arch I saw the distant curve of the great hall, now stripped of its illusions. The high ceiling was bare stone, candles guttered, tables lay overturned, their careful symmetry shattered. For a few breaths the noise seemed to recede, as if the gallery sat in the eye of the storm. I sank onto a bench, lungs burning, and listened to the faint vibrations in the stone. Above me, below me, all around, the struggle for the future of the North raged. Alliances collapsing, loyalties rebranded, lives cut short by decisions made over maps and fine wine. I realized, with a clarity that still chills me, that words like brotherhood, council, and conclave were dissolving in real time. By dawn, they would refer to something else entirely, or to nothing at all. Institutions that had seemed as solid as the rock of Thaned were cracking like plaster. The people in those portraits had believed their designs would last. So did the ones hurling spells down corridors that night. We may still wonder how often certainty is only the name we give to arrangements we have not yet seen fall. Somewhere beyond that stone, Geralt was fighting his own battles, and Ciri was running through nightmares she had never chosen. I, Dandelion, sat in a quiet gallery with my hands still trembling from door latches and near misses, a spectator in a theatre where the actors had begun killing one another with the props. It shames me sometimes that my role in that night was mostly to survive and bear witness. Yet, perhaps, there is a kind of duty even in that. Someone must remember how the walls sounded when they shook, how the lights flickered when fine phrases broke apart, how quickly order turned into competing shouts in the same language. And so I stayed where I was, listening, until the storm moved on and the echoes changed from battle to aftermath. I did not see the Tower of Gulls that night. When its white flank split and its crown broke, I was still sitting in that side gallery, listening to the stone remember how to be fragile. Later, those who had been closer described the moment in different ways. Some said the tower screamed. Others swore it was silent, that the sound had gone somewhere else with the girl who vanished from its height. What we agree on is this: Ciri ran, through corridors that had held her as a student, past faces she knew twisted by fear and fury, through spells that crackled across thresholds like invisible nets. She ran not toward destiny, but away from men and women who had decided without asking her what she was worth. Geralt was somewhere on the island, cutting a path through his own tangle of loyalties and ambushes. Yennefer moved through another part of that collapsing maze, chasing her own impossible balance between love and strategy. Ciri had neither sword nor agenda. She had only speed, terror, and a stubborn refusal to be caught again. They say she reached Torlara, the Tower of Gulls, almost by accident. The old structure loomed over the sea like a story no one had finished telling. Students at Aretusa whispered about it, of course. Strange echoes in its stairwells, lights that appeared in windows that had been sealed for decades. There were warnings woven into lessons, and the softer, older warnings traded under blankets at night. On that night, whatever wards were meant to keep people out or in had already been rattled by the island's convulsions. Doors that had stayed politely shut for generations stood ajar by a finger's width. Spells flickered like dying candles. Power, stretched too thin over too many ambitions, had left cracks in its own shell. Ciri chose one of those cracks and slipped through. I imagine her feet on the worn steps, breath rasping, hand skimming the cold wall as she climbed. Below, Thanedd roared and flared. Above, the tower did what towers do. It waited. Gulls wheeled in the grey air outside, shrieking at nothing in particular, indifferent to the decisions of mages and kings. At the top, in a chamber where the sea wind had always tasted faintly of something older, the thin skin between worlds tore. Some insist that Ciri spoke a word, some lost phrase from an elder tongue that opened the way. Others claim that no spell was needed, that she herself was the key, shaped long ago by promises older than her birth. There are even those who say the tower had been waiting impatiently for an excuse, any excuse, to do what it had been built to do, send something precious somewhere unreachable. I have heard all these versions and set none of them to music. For my part, I imagine a girl who has run as far as she can, hair whipping in the wind, grief and terror roaring in her ears. Perhaps she did speak. Perhaps she only wished, with the whole bruised weight of her being, to be anywhere but there. Sometimes that is enough to tear a path through reality. Light took her. The tower chamber erupted, not with fire, but with a kind of unmaking. Stone, air, and meaning twisted. For a heartbeat, the top of Torlara was wrapped in radiance, bright enough to turn night into glass. When it faded, there was nothing and no one standing where Ciri had been. The tower itself would later crumble, as if embarrassed to have revealed its true purpose. Where she fell to, stories disagree on details and agree on the name, the Korath. A desert so empty it seems like an exaggeration, a cruel joke of the world on cartographers who prefer edges and rivers. Sand as far as the eye can see, not golden, but the colour of bone dust and old parchment. Sky like a lid, wind like a rasp. The Korath has other names, older and less polite. Desert of Death, people call it, when they are feeling dramatic, or perhaps only accurate. Ciri arrived there in the way one arrives in a nightmare. Suddenly, without explanation, with the sound of a world ending still ringing in her bones. One heartbeat, she was in a tower filled with echoes of spells and shouting. The next, she lay half buried in hot, shifting grit under a sun that cared about nothing but itself. You have perhaps stepped from a cool room into noon light and felt your breath catch. Multiply that by every fear you have ever had of being alone, and you will come close to the first minutes of her time in the Korath. No friendly walls, no Geralt, no Yennefer, no mages hurling accusations at one another. Only heat and light so fierce it dissolved edges. Sand crept into her mouth, her eyes, her clothes. Each movement sent tiny avalanches down the slope of her own body. She stood, staggered, turned in a slow circle. No towers, no sea, no continent. The world, as she had known it, had been replaced by one simple instruction: endure or do not. People talk about destiny as if it were a shining road, laid out with milestones and meaningful crossroads. In the Korath, destiny shrank to the next step, the next breath. There was no one to impress, nothing to prove, no prophecy whispering encouragement. There was only the question that wears all others down eventually. Will you get up again? So she walked. Tracks in the sand vanished behind her almost as soon as she made them. The horizon did not change. Thirst arrived quickly, then settled into her bones like a quiet, ruthless tenant. Hunger followed, less sharp in that first day than the realization that there would be no kitchens, no stolen apples, no innkeepers to argue with, only her own dwindling strength. Sometimes she called out, for Geralt, for Yennefer, for anyone. The desert answered with the soft hiss of grains shifting, the occasional dry rattle of something that might have been distant stone. Once she thought she heard hooves, the jingle of tack, familiar voices. She ran toward them, feet stumbling, heart surging. There was nothing. Heat makes kind parodies when it wants to. If you have ever wandered a strange city at night, lost, convinced that every corner will finally reveal a landmark you recognize, you know a gentler, smaller version of that feeling. Each ridge of sand Ciri climbed promised a change and delivered only more of the same. Hope stretched thin becomes its own kind of torment. Night did not bring relief. The sun's rage faded, but the heat it left behind turned suddenly to cold, sharp, and uninvited. The sky over the Korath at night is full of stars, blindingly numerous, cruel in their distance. Under that indifferent blaze she curled into herself, shivering, every grain of sand a separate discomfort. Somewhere in that darkness she must have remembered stories. We all do. Children's tales about lost wanderers, about miracles, about help arriving at the last possible moment. Perhaps she whispered them to herself, half-remembered lines about good spirits and guiding lights. Or perhaps she had already walked far enough through fire and loss to distrust such consolations. When dawn came and found her still breathing, the desert seemed almost surprised. Yet it offered nothing new. No trees, no pools, no friendly shade. Only more distance. She stood again, walked again, fell, rose. The rhythm of survival is not elegant, but it is relentless. Later, when I heard the fragments of this journey from those who had patched them together from druids who read tracks only they can see, from mages who tasted the residue of her passage like a bitter spice in the air, I tried to imagine what kind of strength is born in such places. Not the polished strength courtiers admire, dressed in armour and titles, but something leaner, harsher, a will that has crawled across hot stone and decided against all evidence not to die. We like to say that hardships forge character, as if suffering were a useful tool in the hands of some cosmic craftsman. Face to face with the Korath, such sayings feel obscene. The desert does not forge, it strips. It takes away everything that can be taken, until all that remains is a single stubborn spark that refuses to go out. Ciri carried that spark with her when she finally left the Korath. It would light dark paths later and scorch more than a few fingers, including her own. But on those first days and nights it was small, almost invisible. A lonely child trudging through endless sand is not a sight that inspires ballads in the moment. It is only in retrospect that we recognize such marches as the hinge on which greater stories turn. Looking back, hearing how the girl from a fallen kingdom walked alone under that merciless sky while empires shifted their pieces on maps far away, I cannot help but ask a question that has no graceful rhyme. How many histories have pivoted on the quiet endurance of someone? No one was watching, and we might still wonder whether, in the end, it is those unseen stubborn footsteps that truly decide which prophecies live and which crumble like sand. The desert did not give Ciri a companion. She stole one from it. By the third day in the Korath, her world had shrunk to a narrow strip of sand in front of her toes. She walked because stopping felt too much like agreeing with the desert. Her skin burned and then stopped complaining. Her thoughts blurred into fragments. Water, shade, Geralt, Yennefer, the smell of horses, the sound of rain on a thatched roof, pieces of normal life, shattered and scattered across the dunes. When she first saw the unicorn, she thought it was another mirage, a pale shape on a distant ridge, too clean for this world. Slender legs, a mane like tangled moonlight, a horn catching the cruel sun. It stood perfectly still, watching her with dark, astonished eyes, as if she were the impossible creature in its landscape. She blinked, expecting it to dissolve like the other tricks heat had played on her. It did not. She took a step toward it. Sand slid under her. The unicorn flinched, then lowered its head cautiously, ears flicking. They regarded each other across a few dozen paces of shimmering air. Two beings equally out of place. A child of forests and castles and prophecies, and a creature of stories people tell beside safe hearths. In another life, that meeting might have been the end of a sweet tale. The princess and the unicorn drinking from a hidden spring, sharing silent understanding under stars. But the Korath does not host such stories. It strips fairy tales down to bone. Ciri stumbled, her knees hit the sand. The unicorn stepped closer, one careful pace at a time, nostrils flaring. Perhaps it smelled the things clinging to her. Travel, steel, smoke, magic. Perhaps it smelled only despair, rank and thin, and recognized something it had known in its own way. Whatever its reasons, it did not turn away. Later accounts insist that their minds brushed, that thoughts passed between them without words. Druids speak of ancient bonds between certain bloodlines and certain beasts. Mages argue about resonances and latent abilities. I, who have listened to too many people explain what cannot be explained, prefer a simpler image. A thirsty child leaning against a warm flank, fingers buried in coarse hair, while a creature born of the wild chooses, for reasons beyond our grammar, not to leave. The unicorn led her to what passed for mercy in that place, a shallow hollow where, deep under cracked crust, a thread of moisture lingered, enough to wet lips to trick the body into trying again. Ciri drank, shaking. The unicorn watched, then nudged her shoulder with its horn almost impatiently, as if to say that getting up had become a shared project. Companionship, even in its barest form, changes the colour of suffering. Two walkers in a harsh land will still blister and stumble, but each can look sideways and know that the world is not entirely reduced to their own pain. Ciri began to talk, hoarse and halting, to the creature at her side. Fragments of memory, curses, promises. The unicorn, being wiser than most humans, did not interrupt. Of course, the Korath did not suddenly become kind because a girl had found a friend. The thing that came for them rose from the sand without warning, a shape of chitin and jointed malice. Its exact form matters little. The desert breeds many variants on the same hunger. Claws, mandibles, a body built to burrow and strike. In its blind efficiency, it resembled nothing so much as the polite mechanisms of politics, stripped of veneer. It lunged not at Ciri, but at the unicorn, the healthiest flesh in reach. Fear is one sort of fuel, rage is another. Ciri had been taught to restrain her magic, to shape it, to keep it behind the careful bars of discipline. In that moment, discipline shattered. The desert, the tower, the years of running, the sight of the only living creature who had not tried to claim or cage her about to be torn apart, all of it ignited at once. She reached inward and found not the controlled flows her teachers had tried to impose, but something raw and ancient. Fire answered. It did not arrive as a neat ribbon of flame or a tidy sphere of energy. It erupted, a gout of searing heat that turned sand to glass and air to a shriek. The creature reared, struck, collapsed into a convulsing carcass that smoked in the pit of its own shadow. The unicorn screamed, a terrible, fluting sound as the blast caught it as well. Its flank opened in a red, wet line, its legs buckled. The smell of burned hair and scorched flesh flooded the hollow. Ciri had wanted to protect, she had maimed. The fire did not stop when the threat fell. It wanted more. It roared along channels inside her that had never been meant to carry such a torrent. Pain lanced through her bones, not from the desert now, but from within. Her veins felt stuffed with molten metal. She clutched her head and screamed, though whether in sound or only in raw, wordless force, no one can say. Somewhere in that agony she understood two things with brutal clarity. First, this power could save her and everything she loved, if she could survive it. Second, it could also burn her world to ash just as easily, starting with herself. The unicorn crawled to her. Its wound was deep, blood dark on pale hide. Yet it pushed its head under her arm, lifting, insisting. Get up. not in words, but in the steady, stubborn pressure of its body against hers. Between one heartbeat and the next, the raging fire inside her faltered. Not gone, never gone, but banked. The desert did not care whether she mastered it or not. The unicorn did. They lay together for a long time in a scorched ring of fused sand, both shaking, the dead thing that had attacked them already being reclaimed by the heat. The Korath watched, unimpressed. Another flare, another fading. Those who studied the traces later claimed that this was the moment when the name Falka first coiled itself around Ciri's shadow. Falka, the rebel princess who had once set a city alight in the madness of her revenge. Falka, whose story mothers used to frighten misbehaving children. Whispers began among those who sniffed at prophecy like hounds. A girl with the blood of old kingdoms, wielding forbidden fire, standing in a dead land beside a wounded unicorn. It fit too well. They began to call her that name under their breath, as if naming would make her easier to understand, and thus to use. Names are nets. Some are woven from love, others from fear. Falka was a net of dread and desire, thrown by people who had never watched a half-starved child cradle the neck of a bleeding beast while her own magic tried to kill her. Ciri did not hear those whispers yet. She only knew that she had hurt the one friend the desert had granted her, and that some part of herself recoiled in horror at what it had just done. Shame mingled with terror. She pressed her forehead against the unicorn's coat and promised, in the cracked language of someone with no more tears, that she would never call that fire again. Promises made in such places are always broken, not because the one who makes them is weak, but because the world refuses to leave them alone. Help came at last in the form of hands that smelled of leaves and rain. The druids who found her followed signs invisible to most, patterns in scorched sand, bruises in the fabric of the world. They carried herbs and water, old songs and older patience. They tended the unicorn's wound with murmured phrases and cool poultices. They cooled Ciri's burning insides as best they could, though some damage cannot be undone, only lived with. From them I later heard the most haunting detail, that even in troubled sleep, Ciri's fingers twitched as if searching for a hilt, while her lips formed wordless shapes of denial, not of the desert or the pain, but of the fire itself, as if she were already arguing with a part of her own soul. She woke in a circle of standing stones, under trees that should not have been able to grow in such a land, and for a moment believed herself safe. The unicorn lay nearby, breathing shallowly but alive. Druids watched from the shadows, their faces carved by weather and worry. For a brief span, it seemed, she had been rescued from the desert. In truth, she had only exchanged one wilderness for another, the trackless space inside herself where fire and fear now lived side by side. But we might still wonder whether, without that searing moment in the Korath, without the wound, the scream, the reckless mercy of a unicorn that refused to abandon her, the girl who stepped into the wider world afterward would have become anything like the Ciri, whose name the North now shudders to pronounce. The first thing you learn in a war is how quickly stories change uniforms. After Thaned, I did what bards have always done in the wake of disasters. I fled, and I listened. Aretusa shrank behind me into rumour even as its stones were still cooling. By the time I reached the mainland, The tale of the attempted Nilfgaardian coup had already sprouted 3 endings and 4 sets of heroes. Each kingdom picked the version that made its own rulers look most far-sighted. Truth lay somewhere under the pile, thin and bruised. My own part in the affair did not interest officials until later. At first, I was merely another shaken traveller, smelling of smoke and high magic. Gorsvellen, which had once greeted us with the noise of trade and quarrels, greeted me now with patrols at every corner, and fresh proclamations nailed over older ones. New decrees hung like bandages over wounds no one wanted to inspect. By authority of the Northern Council, these papers announced curfews, searches, lists of persons to be questioned. The ink barely dried before another sheet was pasted over, this time blaming a different set of mages, a different configuration of traitors. The only constant was the tone, firm, certain, fatherly, if your father had always suspected you of something. They came for me in the middle of a song. I was halfway through a melancholy piece in a dockside tavern, my audience divided between men trying to forget and men trying to believe they had nothing to remember. I had just reached the line about a fisherman who returned to find his village gone when the door opened and a draught of cold iron and colder authority swept in. 3 men in uniform, none of them decorative. They did not shout. They did not need to. The room folded around them. The tallest read my name aloud and added the polite formula about a request to assist with inquiries. His hand rested near the hilt at his side in a way that made refusal look purely theoretical. I considered an improvised verse about their admirable timing. I swallowed it. There is a time for wit, and a time for learning how high a man can fall down stone steps. They took me first to a modest building near the harbour. From the outside it resembled any other office. Shutters, a door, a bored clerk at a desk. Inside, the walls thickened. Questions began. Where had I been on the night of the Thanid disturbances? Which mages had I entertained in the weeks prior? Had any of them spoken favourably of Nilfgaard? Had I received payments not recorded in certain ledgers that I was not allowed to see? I answered with the careful honesty of someone who has watched too many friends disappear between one sunrise and the next. Yes, I had played for sorcerers. That is what one does when they pass the hat in such circles. No, I had not been invited to their councils. Bards are witnesses, not architects. I described the songs, not the secrets. I embroidered the harmless details, left the dangerous ones plain. It is a peculiar skill, this selective candour. If I have any talent beyond rhymes, it lies there. They asked about Geralt too, of course, where he was, whom he served, what he intended. I told them the truth they could least use. He served monsters, which rarely issue official statements. He intended, as far as I knew, to stay alive and keep a promise to a girl the North had already begun to label with other people's sins. Their quills scratched unimpressed. In the end, they decided I knew too much and too little to be left alone. So they moved me deeper. The city prison had been built for drunks, thieves, and the occasional unfortunate political dissident back when such people were rare. It now bulged. My cell was a rectangle of stone with an iron door and a narrow window that let in a slice of indifferent sky. I shared it with 2 others, a merchant whose crime had been selling grain to the wrong buyer a week too late, and a former soldier who could not stop repeating 2 phrases. In the old order, he said, he had been a hero. In the new one, he was an inconvenience. We learned quickly that our keepers were as uncertain as we were. Guards argued in the corridor about which mages were currently outlawed and which kings now claimed the mantle of saviour. New instructions arrived daily, then hourly. One morning, a prisoner down the hall was marched out as a suspected collaborator with Nilfgaard. That evening, a different official came through with a list declaring the man a useful informant instead. The cell returned him the next day, shaken but alive. The rest of us learned a lesson that no proclamation admitted. Labels were being glued on and ripped off faster than anyone could keep track. From the barred window we could see a slice of the harbour. Warships gathered, bristling with unnecessarily polished metal. Their banners changed almost as frequently as the posters in the streets. Sometimes they carried the crests of united northern kingdoms. Sometimes they flew only one king's colours, larger than before. Each configuration claimed to represent the true heart of resistance against Nilfgaard. To the fishermen whose boats bobbed like splinters in their shadow, the distinction mattered less. Dock fees had risen, inspections had tripled. A net torn by a patrol boat was still a torn net. The prison was a market of stories. In one cell, a tax collector insisted that he had been imprisoned for doing his duty too enthusiastically. In another, a minor mage swore she had always opposed the Brotherhood's arrogance, and was only here because she had failed to denounce the right colleague at the right time. A tailor who had once sewn for the garrison now muttered that uniforms looked the same no matter who wore them, and that he would, in future, prefer to stitch curtains. Listening to them, I realized that the time of contempt had found its everyday voice. It spoke not only in manifestos and royal speeches, but in the resigned tone of people who had discovered that their lives could be turned inside out by decisions made in rooms they would never enter. Yesterday's patriot became today's suspect with the stroke of a quill. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would become a hero in a revised report. We were allowed out into the yard once a day. There, under a strip of grudging sky, prisoners exchanged findings the way scholars trade notes. Who had been taken to questioning and not returned? Which guard seemed more sympathetic? Which rumour from outside had seeped through the cracks? War in the east, border skirmishes, skirmishes upgraded to battles, battles upgraded in official language to glorious stands. I learned that in some cities, mages who had once commanded respect now travelled in chains, escorted by soldiers who barely understood what they were guarding against. In others, new councils of sorcerers had formed overnight, swearing loyalty to this or that king, rubbing out old titles and painting new ones in the same rooms. Ordinary folk watched, working harder for less, wondering when the promised safety would begin to feel like something other than tighter control. One afternoon, a boy no older than 16 was thrown into our cell. Dirt smeared his face. He smelled of burned straw and panic. The soldier on duty muttered that the lad had shouted the wrong slogan during a speech in the square, or perhaps he had shouted the right one at the wrong time. The details blurred. The result was the same. The boy raged for an hour, promising vengeance on whatever authority had decided his fate. Then, exhausted, he sank onto the floor and asked us if we thought he would be released once they realized their mistake. The merchant looked away. The former soldier said nothing at all. I told a quiet story about a man who survived a siege by learning when to speak and when to listen. It was not the answer he wanted, but it was the only honest one I had. Days blurred, interrogations came and went. My status changed on paper from person of interest to suspect to potential asset and back again. All without my behavior altering in the slightest. The outside world flowed past our walls like a river, swollen with news I could taste only in droplets. Nilfgaard moved. The north tried to move in unison and instead jerked in several directions at once. Refugees appeared in the streets beyond, then vanished toward other, more distant prisons of circumstance. Eventually, someone somewhere decided that a bard with a good memory was more useful loose than locked away. Perhaps a sympathetic clerk misfiled my papers. Perhaps a spymaster required a pair of eyes and ears still considered marginally trustworthy. The reasons were never explained. One morning the door scraped open and a guard, looking almost annoyed, told me to gather my things. My things amounted to a lute, a fading shirt, and a head full of impressions too sharp to be called songs yet. As I stepped out into air that tasted of fish, smoke, and declarations, I realized that the world had not paused while I sat behind stone. New alliances had formed, old ones had shattered, borders had shifted on maps. People in clean clothes spoke of the new order with the confidence of those who imagine themselves on the winning side. Yet the poor, the displaced, the tired faces leaning from windows along the prison street, all looked very much as they had before, only their fear had grown more articulate. I walked with my lute case bumping against my leg, wondering what to call what I had just seen. Crackdown, purge, restructuring. Each word carried its own melody. None quite matched the raw sound of a prison yard where men and women traded their latest identities like worn coats. We like to pretend that when systems change, they do so cleanly. Old signs taken down, new signs hung, histories rewritten in crisp language. From my brief confinement in the belly of Gors Velen's new order, I can tell you it is messier. It is the confusion in a guard's eyes as he tries to remember which prisoners are traitors today. It is the quaver in a clerk's voice when he reads a decree that contradicts yesterday's with equal certainty. It is the way ordinary people learn to speak in careful half-sentences, to lower their voices when naming anyone who might be listening. I walked free, but I carried that yard with me. Every time, later, that a king spoke of justice, restored or order maintained, I saw again the narrow window of my cell, and the boy who had shouted the wrong words on the wrong day. And I could not help wondering how many such cells it takes to build a peace that can stand, and whether anyone truly counts them when they tally the cost of victory. I did not see Geralt fall on Thanedd, but for days afterward the continent spoke of nothing else. Not always by name, of course. People said a certain witcher, the way they say a certain illness when they wish to seem discreet and fail. Rumours spread like smoke that he had died defending mages, that he had cut down mages in the name of kings, that he had vanished into the sea. Each version told you more about the teller's hopes than about Geralt. What I know of his journey to the forest came from quieter mouths. One was a woman who had carried messages for the druids and knew the paths around Brokilon better than any mapmaker. Another was a dryad whose words reached me later, filtered through the puzzled recollection of a merchant who had once been their reluctant guide. Fragments, all of it, like pieces of a lute dropped from a tower. I gathered what I could and tried, as bards do, to imagine the missing notes. They say he lay where he had fallen for some time, on a strip of ground scorched by spells and stained by more ordinary violence. Around him the night of Thaned burned itself out. Mages died or were captured. Soldiers retreated or advanced, often in the wrong directions. Flags changed hands. Lofty plans shrank to survival. Geralt lay still in the middle of it, a man who had been promised nothing by the world and yet found himself paying for its bargains. Someone moved him, that much is certain. A hand that did not belong to any king, mage, or spymaster wrapped his broken body in rough cloth and dragged him from the island of fine intentions. Perhaps it was an ally from that tangled night. Perhaps only a soul who could not bear to see one more shape left, cooling on the stones. In times like those, heroism often looks like lifting weight you should not be able to carry. The path from Thaned to Brokilon is not a straight one. It bends through villages, still counting the cost of earlier wars, over roads clogged with refugees who have not yet learned which banners they should flee. I imagine Geralt half-conscious on a cart that jolted with every rut. Above him, a sky indifferent to his pain. Around him, the murmur of people telling one another how the world had changed yesterday, as if they themselves had not been trampled in the process. By the time the cart reached the edges of Brokilon, his rescuer had done what could be done with bandages and hope. That is where the forest took over. Brokilon is not a friendly woodland with berry bushes and pleasant shade. It is old, and it remembers when men were not the main story. Trees there grow as they please, gnarled and thick, their roots twisting over soil that smells of leaf rot and secrets. Light filters through the canopy in narrow shafts, like spears held at rest. Birds call, but seldom the kind you recognize. Those who cross its borders without invitation tend not to cross back. Yet for a witcher, and for a handful of others, Brokilon has occasionally made exceptions. Perhaps it is because dryads know the shape of predators who kill for hunger rather than sport. Perhaps the forest itself recognizes wounded things that have spent their lives hunting worse monsters than any found among its roots. They say the dryads came soundlessly, stepping from behind trunks that had not seemed wide enough to hide them. Bows whispering, arrows knocked but not loosed. They looked at the broken man on the cart, at the one who had brought him, at the restless horses whose eyes rolled whites at the scents in the air. Then they spoke to the forest in a tongue that made the leaves tremble, and decided he would not die on the threshold. He woke to green, not the gentle green of meadows or cultivated gardens, but the dense, layered green of a place that does not care to be understood. Leaves high above, ferns low at his sides, moss under his fingers. The air tasted of damp bark, herb smoke, and something bitter that clung to the back of the throat. He tried to move, and the forest answered with pain. The dryads did what they could. Their healing is not the neat art of temple physicians, nor the clever rearranging of flesh practiced by some mages. It is slower, rooted in patience and plants. They set bones as they had set branches after storms. They smeared pastes that stung and then numbed. They watched. Geralt drifted in and out of awareness, his dreams full of towers, seas, and a girl's voice he could not quite reach. Into this slow convalescence walked Milva. Her true name is another matter, one she would likely not thank me for sharing, even if I were certain of it. She was a hunter who had earned the trust of Brokilon in the hardest way, by surviving it honestly. A woman with sharp eyes, a quicker tongue, and a bow that sang more accurately than most poets. The Dryads had come to rely on her as a bridge to the wider world, someone who could move in both directions without betraying either. She took one look at Geralt, and, I am told, said something unflattering about men who tried to die in inconvenient places. It was Milva who sat by him when the Dryads were busy. Milva who forced broth past his stubborn lips. Milva who answered his questions in the clipped, unsentimental way of someone who has buried enough people to be cautious about growing attached. She told him what had happened beyond the trees, not all of it at once. News, like medicine, must be given in doses. He learned that the Brotherhood had shattered, that kings were busy rewriting alliances while calling it preservation, that Nilfgaard had not paused to debate ethics, but moved where the lines had thinned, that mages who had once strutted through courts now travelled in chains or vanished into quiet, unpleasant rooms. Each new fact settled over him like another layer of bandage, heavy and constricting. And he learned, in pieces, about Ciri. At first, the stories were wild. A girl seen on Thanedd running through flying debris. A girl disappearing in a column of light. A girl in a desert that had no name. A girl leading a band of outlaws. Prophecies tangled her name with others, old and blood-soaked. Milva, who had little patience for omens, cut through the worst of the nonsense. Somewhere out there, she said, was a child Geralt had called his own. That was reason enough. Healing in Brokilon is not merely a matter of bones knitting. The forest asks questions without speaking. It presses its silence against the thoughts of those who rest there. For a man who had clung to neutrality all his life, who had insisted that witches do not choose sides, that silence must have been a hard mirror. He had tried not to belong to anything larger than his contracts and his odd little family of outcasts. The world had not accepted the offer. It had taken Ciri, smashed the structures that had allowed her to hide, and then scattered her into its most dangerous corners. Neutrality in such a landscape began to look less like honour and more like abandonment. Milva watched him wrestle with that. She was not, by nature, gentle. She mocked him when he brooded too long, called him names that would blister more delicate ears, reminded him that wallowing helps no one. Yet, behind the barbs lay a fierce, almost reluctant compassion. She had seen too many men drink themselves into stupors or drift into fatalism. She refused to add another to the count if she could help it. In the evenings, when the forest dimmed and the sounds of birds gave way to crickets and distant, unclassified calls, they spoke more quietly. She told him about refugees she had seen on the roads, people with everything they owned on their backs, eyes stretched thin by fear. He spoke haltingly of Ciri's laughter, of Yennefer's pride, of the maddening ordinary days in Kaer Morhen when winter's cold seemed the worst of their troubles. Somewhere in those conversations a promise formed, not the kind sanctified by altars or laws. A simpler, harder one, that he would leave the forest regardless of how crooked his bones still felt, and go looking for the girl no matter what flags snapped over the roads, that he would stop pretending he could avoid the great currents, and instead choose one, not the banners of kings or the sigils of mages, but the fragile line of a single life. Broccolon did not argue. Forests have no opinion on the affairs of men and their foundlings, but perhaps the trees leaned a little closer when he spoke those words. Perhaps they recognized in his voice the tone of someone who has finally understood that not choosing is also a choice. When at last he stood, still stiff, still bearing the ache of old wounds, Milver was ready before he was. Quiver full, bow strung, pack adjusted with ruthless efficiency. She claimed she was only escorting him as far as the next sensible turn in the road, that a witcher half held together with dryad salves could not be trusted to manage even simple directions. We know how such declarations usually end. People who insist they are only accompanying you for a short distance rarely mean it, or rarely stay lucky enough to keep it true. So, he stepped out of Broccolon's green dusk into a world that had rearranged itself while he mended. Behind him, a forest that remembered older ages. Beside him, a woman who swore she wanted only to be rid of him as soon as possible. Ahead of him, war rumors and the thin, stubborn hope of finding one child in a land that had turned hunting people into a profession. When I think of Geralt in those first days after the forest, I do not see the silvered killer of ballads striding through flames. I see a limping man, pale with the effort of each step, jaw set, eyes fixed on a horizon he could not yet see. And I cannot help wondering whether it is that quiet, painful walk, more than any later clash of blades, that truly marks the moment, when the time of contempt lost its claim on him, and he chose, instead, the time of keeping a promise. News of Ciri's time with the rats reached me the way gossip about comets does. Late, distorted, wrapped in fear. By the time her name drifted through tavern smoke and campfires again, people no longer called her the princess from Cintra or the witcher's child. They spoke instead of Falca, with the particular relish reserved for outlaws distant enough to admire and close enough to blame. I pieced the story together from fragments. A merchant who had lost a wagon to a laughing gang in bright rags. A village elder who swore a girl with ashen hair had ridden through at dusk. Cloak flapping, gaze hard as flint. A smudged report from a Nilfgaardian patrol, copied by a scribe whose hand shook when he wrote the word Falca. None of them knew the child. I had watched nod off over her supper in Kaer Morhen. They knew only the blade. The Rats, they called themselves. A band of young outlaws who treated borders like rumours and laws like background noise. Kaylee, Iskra, Asa, Missile, and the rest names that sounded like nicknames even when they were not. They robbed caravans, mocked petty officials, relieved tax collectors of their purses, stole horses simply for the joy of the gallop. To some, they were vermin. To others, they were a necessary insult to a world that had forgotten what it looked like from below. Ciri fell in among them as a wounded bird falls into a flock of crows, half rescue, half devouring. They took in this thin, scarred girl who rode and fought like someone with no intention of dying on anyone else's schedule. They gave her a new name, sharpened enough to sever the old, and in return she gave them something they had never possessed, the feeling that fate itself rode at their head. Among them she learned a different sort of magic. Not the disciplined craft of Arethusa, nor the raw fire of the Korath, but the enchantment of belonging. There is a particular intoxication in moving as part of a pack, knowing that your laughter is echoed by other throats, your anger amplified by other fists. Rules shrink to 2 words, with us or against us. The world, which had spent so long treating Ciri as an object to be pursued, suddenly became prey. I imagine her first raid with them, hooves drumming on rutted tracks, wind tearing at her eyes. The shouted signal, carts wrenched sideways as drivers hauled at reins, the startled faces of guards reaching for weapons a heartbeat too late. And in the middle of it, the fierce, dizzying knowledge that, this time, she was not the one being hunted. The rats wrapped their violence in jokes. They forced arrogant stewards to dance in the road, carved crude symbols into the doors of bullies, tossed stolen bread to hungry children. Tales of their exploits spread faster than the proclamations condemning them. In an age when kings burned villages for reasons of state, the gang's chaotic cruelty almost looked like justice to those who had stopped believing in any other kind. Ciri Falca, as they now called her, threw herself into that life with the fervour of someone trying to drown quieter voices. The tower, the desert, the bleeding unicorn, the hands that had tried to shape her were all still there, just beneath the skin. The rats offered a simpler script. We take, we strike back, we do not apologize. She cut her hair shorter, hardened her body with sleepless nights and constant tension, let laughter become a shield sharper than any sword. Yet even in the stories told by those who admired them, something more complicated shows through. A stable boy remembered how Falca's hand trembled, just for a moment, before she hit the overseer who had beaten him. A captured guard swore that when he begged for his life, it was not simple cruelty he saw in her eyes, but a desperate need not to hesitate. Hesitation is dangerous in such circles. The rats survived by moving first, laughing loudest, refusing to see their targets as human for longer than it took to empty a purse or land a blow. There is a comfort in that too. If every victim is only a symbol of the world that wronged you, your conscience shrinks to the size of your own hurt. From my safer distance, I tried to map the girl I remembered onto the outlaw described at my table. I thought of Ciri's clumsy attempts to hold a lute, her solemn fascination with the way strings turned touch into sound. I recalled her questions about ballads that ended badly, about whether heroes ever turned away instead of charging. Somewhere inside Falca, that child still breathed. But the North had not been kind to her. Every time she reached for softness, the world had slapped her hand. There is a grim logic in joining those who bite first. When you have been treated as a prize, an object to be captured and exchanged, it can feel like victory to become the threat instead. The rats' reckless raids, their mocking defiance, their foul-mouthed camaraderie. All of it must have seemed like freedom after corridors of polished stone and the disciplined fear of magical classrooms. Yet freedom built entirely from spite is a narrow room. Its walls move with you. Wherever Falca rode, the desert rode within her. The tower fell again behind her, the unicorn bled at her side. Each fresh act of bravado brought a moment's silence, quickly spent. So she pushed harder. Faster horses, rougher jokes, riskier fights. Speed to outpace thought. The people who cursed the rats did so in the same breath they used to cheer grand armies. Their outrage over stolen grain and humiliated tax collectors burned hotter than their concern for towns crushed by necessary campaigns. It is easier to hate the outlaws who splash mud on your boots than the distant lords who ordered your son to die on a border you will never see. In that hypocrisy, the rats found justification. We prefer our tales tidy. If a child is broken by the world, we want her either to remain pure in her suffering or to turn entirely black with hatred. Ciri did neither. She became something jagged, shifting, painfully alive. Falca was not a mask she donned for fun. It was armor grown over wounds, too tight to remove without bleeding. Later, when solemn men wanted me to fix her story into a single lesson, a warning against rebellion, or a hymn to resistance, I found I could not oblige. All I could see was a young woman riding too fast through a country that had already failed her, surrounded by laughter that hovered one note away from a scream. And I might still wonder, when I hear people condemn or idolize the rats with equal ease, how many of them would choose differently if the world had stripped them as it stripped Ciri. Of every gentler option before offering them only a horse, a gang, and a name sharp enough to keep the pain at bay for one more night. By the time I found Geralt again, the world had grown both louder and smaller. Towns buzzed with grand words about campaigns and alliances. Yet, for those of us on the road, the war was mostly shortages and stares. More soldiers at bridges, more names you were not supposed to say aloud. More people who reacted to strangers the way a dog reacts to thunder. I followed rumours like crumbs, a white-haired witcher, limping, travelling with an archer who swore more fluently than most men prayed. Each story disagreed on details, but all agreed on one point. Wherever he passed, he asked about a girl. We met on a rutted track between two villages too tired to be afraid of each other. Evening had blurred the horizon to grey. I heard hooves, low voices, a woman's short, impatient laugh. Then they appeared over the rise. I knew Milva first. No one else sits a horse as if daring it to argue. Behind her rode Geralt, shoulders heavier, hair longer, eyes flatter, as if the world had taken him by the collar and shaken him hard. Two others followed, a young man in armor that fit him like a confession he was not ready to make, and a wiry, sharp-faced girl whose grin looked like a dare. Geralt reined in. For a heartbeat, we only looked at one another. "You are late," he said. "Lost my way," I answered. "Too many banners, not enough signposts." Milva snorted. The girl announced that I did not look important enough to be worth arresting, which was, she added, probably my only virtue. I liked her at once. We camped by a crooked stream that smelled of mud and mint, while Milva picketed the horses and cursed quietly at a knot in a girth strap. Geralt and I walked a little apart. In rough, economical phrases, he told me what had happened since Brokilon. Leads chased and lost, borders tightening, people closing their doors sooner each night. I answered with what I knew of Ciri's new shadow. The rats, the name Falca, the way frightened men used it to excuse fresh cruelty. "They are turning her into a banner," he said. "Yes, she is not a banner. No, a child," he added, more to himself than to me. There was nothing wise to say to that, so I said nothing. Back at the fire, names settled onto faces. The armoured man was Cahir, Nilfgaardian by birth and penitent by choice, wearing his guilt like extra mail. The girl, Angoulême, boasted cheerfully of small crimes, bad jokes, and running with gangs that made respectable folk cross the street. Later, another figure joined us, walking in on a dusk thick with midges. Regis, who called himself a barber-surgeon and smelled faintly of wine, herbs, and something that made my instincts hum uneasily. I did not pry. Few people on that road had true names they wished examined too closely. We were, in short, a ridiculous little procession. A witcher who had finally picked a direction, an archer with no patience for fools, a former enemy soldier, an ex-gang girl, a physician with mysterious resources, and a bard who still believed that songs might keep people from falling apart. Our path zigzagged through a north that no longer recognized its own map. We skirted armies when we could, slipped through towns tense with rumors, traded news with peddlers and deserters at smoky fires. Every night brought a different version of the same story. Kings declaring themselves saviors, mages swearing they had always opposed the people who had just fallen, generals explaining that scorched barns meant security. Geralt listened without much comment. His compass never wavered. Whatever border we crossed, he stepped over it with the same question in his mouth. Where had anyone seen a girl with ashen hair? I watched him in the small moments. In a plundered village, we found doors kicked in, cupboards empty, children picking through the wreckage for crumbs. The soldiers who had done the work wore northern colours. The orders had come wrapped in words like requisition and strategic necessity. Geralt left coins on a splintered table, more than we could comfortably spare. "It will not fix anything," I said. "No," he replied, "but it will be remembered differently." On another day, a squad at a bridge demanded a toll high enough to make honest passage impossible. Their captain's badge bore the sigil of a lord famous for cruelty and piety in equal measure. I began to reach for my purse. Geralt's hand went to his sword instead, calmly, as if selecting the right word in a sentence. The captain looked into his eyes, considered, then stepped aside. "We are not worth the trouble," Milva muttered as we rode on. "That is one way to put it," I said. "Another is that he saw a man who has stopped moving out of anyone's way unless children are involved. At night, when the others slept or pretended to, I took out my lute. Habit is a stubborn god. I played softly. Old marches turned slow and thoughtful. Love songs from years when the world had seemed less frayed. Short tunes about home that mean different things to different ears. Milva lay with her back to me, eyes closed, lips moving along with lines she claimed never to have heard. Cahir stared into the dark as if measuring the distance between who he had been and who he might become. Angoulême hummed off key and fired questions about people in my songs, most of them impertinent. Regis listened very still, like someone weighing each note against memories he would never describe. One evening he asked mildly, why so many of my ballads focused on people no one had thanked? "Victories already have heralds," I said. "Someone should speak for small decencies." He smiled, faint and odd. "Perhaps that is what bards are for," he said, "to keep the scale from looking entirely foolish." As days wore on, my role among them shifted. I was not only the man who could charm an innkeeper into lowering the price of a room or bluff a guard with a story about a concert for some distant duke. I was also the one who remembered, the one who put quiet acts into words. I saw Milver repack Kahir's saddlebags without comment when his hands shook too much. I saw Kahir, who once rode with black banners, carry a farmer's lame daughter across a ford because the water terrified her. I saw Angoulême slip her share of stolen bread into the hands of street boys who tried to spit at her and failed. None of these things would appear in any royal chronicle. All of them deserve to live somewhere. Yet with each memory I gathered, a doubt grew sharper. Was I there as friend or as archivist? If the worst came, would I stand and be broken with them? Or would I duck away, telling myself that someone must survive to sing? The question sat with me until one pale afternoon when nothing was trying to kill us. We rested on a slope above fields gone wild, the harvest trampled or never sown. Geralt sat a little apart, sharpening a blade he had already sharpened that morning. "What am I to you on this road?" I asked. "Decoration. Witness? Excuse?" He looked up, genuinely puzzled. "You are my friend," he said. It was nothing like the grand declarations our age seemed to favour. No vows, no speeches about destiny, just that flat, familiar voice stating a fact. And if your friend dies chasing stories about a girl the world insists on turning into a symbol, I said. "What then?" "Then my friend dies," he answered. "And someone who heard him will remember." For all its bleakness, the answer steadied me. It admitted what we spend most of our lives avoiding, that our value does not rest on whether history writes our names in gold, but on whether our presence tilts a few hearts, a few choices, however slightly. So I stayed, not only to observe, but to lean, however lightly, in the same direction. I sang in frightened villages to remind people they were more than numbers in someone else's ledger. I argued with innkeepers who wanted to turn away refugees and occasionally won. I shouted warnings when I happened, by some perverse miracle, to see an ambush before the Witcher did. I turned our shared weariness into jokes that made us laugh instead of snap at one another. The time of contempt had given the world a new fluency in hatred. Every town square echoed with speeches about traitors and purges, loyalty and punishment. Against that roar, our little company tried, in our uneven way, to practice something quieter. Stubborn loyalty to a lost child, to one another, to the idea that decency did not have to be negotiated at the point of a sword. Perhaps that is what my songs became then. Not decorations on the story, but small acts of refusal. Refusal to forget the nameless faces we passed. Refusal to accept that contempt was the only language left. We walked on, following a trail that thinned with every mile, hoping that at its end we would find not a legend or a curse, but a young woman whose real name still waited under all the others. And we might still wonder whether our trudging steps mattered to the continent at large. I cannot answer that. I only know they mattered to me, and that I intend, as long as breath cooperates, to make sure they are not entirely lost in the noise. Years have passed since the days I have been telling you about. Names that once cracked like whips over the continent are softer now on innkeepers' tongues. New kings stamp fresh symbols on coins. New decrees are nailed over old, and war has come and gone in waves, altering borders a little, and lives beyond counting. Yet when people lean across tables and ask about the time of contempt, they rarely want ledgers of regiments or the wording of treaties. They ask about her. They ask about him. About the girl who vanished from a tower with light at her back and dust from a dead land in her hair, and the witcher who limped after her through forests and conspiracies, always one turn of the road behind and exactly where he needed to be. I answer as best I can. I say that Ciri did not remain the frightened child of Kaer Morhen, nor the half-starved wanderer of the Korath, nor the laughing outlaw the rats tried to make her. She became all of those and something more. Someone who had walked through contempt and refused, at last, to live by its rules. I say that Geralt, who once clung to neutrality as stubbornly as other men cling to flags, chose instead to stand with a few ordinary, obstinate souls and call that his side. The grander details they can find in chronicles. My trade is in evenings and glances. I remember one such evening on the road, long after Brokilon and long before any roof we dared to call our own. We were camped in a shallow hollow, the wind for once minding its own business. Milva sat with her bow across her knees, rubbing a cramp from her hand. Regis tended a pot whose steam smelled of herbs and patient thoughts. The others had drifted into their own small silences. Geralt sat close to the fire on a low stone, hands around a chipped cup. His swords lay within reach, as always, but the tightness had gone a little from his shoulders. For that one night we were not planning how to avoid an army or slip across some captain's line of authority. The quiet felt strange, like a room you are certain you have not paid for. I took out my lute. My fingers found an old tune I had once played in a leaky tavern for men worrying about harvests instead of campaigns. A simple song about a man who comes home late, not from glory, but from work, and a woman who scolds him with words that mean, in a truer language, "I am glad you are alive." As I played, their faces changed. Milva's frown loosened. Someone laughed softly at a line I had never thought particularly clever. Regis smiled without his usual irony. Geralt listened, not with the wary stillness of a man measuring distant hoofbeats, but with the quiet attention of someone allowing himself, briefly, to be exactly where he is. When the song ended, he gave a small nod. It was not applause. It was better. Moments like that were small, easily missed beside the bright explosions of history. Yet I have come to believe they were the true opposite of contempt. Not victories shouted from battlements, but simple refusals to let the world turn us entirely into weapons or spectators. A shared tune, a bowl passed from hand to hand, a joke that makes everyone laugh at themselves instead of at someone weaker. Later, when our little company scattered along their necessary roads, I tried to carry those quiet scenes with me. I sang in courts where officials wanted only to hear that their side had been right all along, and in alehouses where no one wished to hear anything that reminded them of kings. In both places I smuggled in verses about dryads lifting a broken man from a cart, druids bending over a wounded unicorn, a girl in stolen clothes choosing, at the last moment, not to strike too hard. Even now, when people insist that the time of contempt was defined by mages and emperors, I remember faces with no titles. An innkeeper hiding 2 shaking children in his pantry while soldiers searched the yard. A washerwoman tearing up her last decent dress for bandages without asking which side the wounded man had served. A gate guard looking at our papers, then at our eyes, and deciding quite consciously to see nothing at all. None of them thought themselves heroic. They were simply tired people who, for one heartbeat, chose kindness over safety or convenience. You ask me where Ciri is now, and whether Geralt truly found her. You want to know if they were reunited in joy or in grief, whether prophecy ended in thunder or in silence. I could answer you with the versions fashionable in ballads, some tragic, some triumphant, all tidy. They would be false in the same way. They would make the story stop. Life does not. People go on. They grow older or stranger. They love badly and well, hesitate at the wrong moments, stand firm when no one is watching. So I will say only this. Somewhere beyond the borders drawn since Thaned, a witcher still follows roads other men avoid, and a woman who once walked through desert and fire still carries, in the set of her shoulders, the knowledge that she survived both. Sometimes their paths cross, sometimes they do not. In either case, the fact of their having chosen one another once continues to work in the world like a quiet spell. You may not see it, but you can feel its echo wherever mercy appears for no very sensible reason. As for me, I have grown older. My fingers stumble on strings that once obeyed without complaint. My voice frays in cold weather. Hills I used to climb while arguing about rhymes now make my knees creak. I travel less. More often I sit in the corner of some inn and let stories come to me instead. The questions are always the same. What really happened? What were they really like? Did she laugh? Did he ever smile? Did anyone, in those years of suspicion and marching boots, manage to keep hold of something gentle? I cannot give anyone the whole truth. No single throat could hold it without breaking. So I choose a night by a campfire, an argument in a stable, a shared loaf on a rain-soaked road. I speak of the way Ciri used to tilt her head when she was trying not to show she cared, and of the way Geralt softened his steps when passing sleeping children, as if afraid to wake not only them, but an older grief that never entirely sleeps. As I talk, I watch my listeners. Some lean forward, eager to judge. Others lean back, searching for reasons to hope. A few close their eyes and simply listen, as if the sound of someone remembering were a kind of shelter. Outside, new contempt sprouts where the old was cut down. People find fresh words for the same ancient fears. I cannot stop that. I'm only a man with a battered lute and an inconveniently good memory. But I can ask you, as I ask them, to carry away not only the image of towers fallen and deserts burning, but the quieter knowledge that in the middle of all that, people still reached for one another. That a witcher who claimed to belong nowhere built around himself a small circle of loyalty no decree could fully break. That a girl whom prophecy tried to turn into a weapon insisted in ways large and small on being a person instead. If, after listening, you are a little less ready to speak of strangers with easy contempt, if you hesitate before agreeing that whole crowds deserve whatever comes to them, if you look twice at the next frightened face you pass on the road, then these words will have done their work as well as any spell ever did. I will end here. The fire is low, and even tales must rest. Somewhere beyond these walls the wind is worrying at shutters, just as it did on other nights in other inns when we were younger and more afraid than we admitted. The world beyond your door may not be kinder than the one I have described. It may, in some ways, be worse. But it is still full of people capable of small, stubborn mercies. Listen for them. Make room for them. Add your own, however slight, to the sum. And perhaps, when future ages give some new name to the troubles that await them, they will still be able to look back and say that in our time, too, there were moments when we chose something other than contempt.